HOA Karen called the police on me only for them to discover she'd been squatting in my house for 3 weeks. I had just finished a grueling week at work, one that felt like it had stretched endlessly, each day heavier than the last, and I decided to leave the office early, craving nothing more than the familiar sanctuary of my own home, the soft hum of air in the vents, the subtle creak of the hardwood floors, the warm glow of lamps that had been waiting patiently for my return, imagining the blissful quiet of my living room, the faint smell of my wife's lavender candles lingering in the air from the night before, and even the simple comfort of my own coffee mug resting on the counter as if it had been saving its warmth just for me. But as I turned the corner onto my street and slowed down, I immediately noticed something that made my stomach knot and my hands tighten around the steering wheel. A minivan that did not belong to any guest I was expecting, parked suspiciously close to my front lawn. A vehicle I knew all too well because it belonged to Karen, my neighbor. The woman who seemed to take a personal interest in monitoring everyone's business in the neighborhood, her usual scowl exaggerated, sharper, as if she had been waiting specifically for me to arrive. And the way her eyes were fixed on the approaching officer made the scene feel surreal, almost cinematic, like something out of a bad sitcom, yet terrifyingly real, the sort of moment where your instincts scream at you to stop, to think, but your brain struggles to process the absurdity of what is unfolding. Because there was no one else in sight except her, the police officer, and now me pulling into my own driveway. Before I could even reach for the door handle, Karen's frantic waving caught my attention, her hand slicing through the air like a semaphore signaling some terrible emergency. And my heart sank as Officer Daniels, a man I recognized from previous patrols in the neighborhood, approached cautiously, his uniform slightly stiff as if he were unsure of what he was walking into, and his voice was calm but carried a trace of hesitation as he said, "Ma'am, I got a call about someone trespassing." His eyes flicking nervously toward me, the rightful owner of the home in question, and I felt a surge of disbelief because how could someone actually call the cops on me, in my own home, without even a second thought, without bothering to knock or ask any questions? And Karen's expression, a mixture of triumph and urgency, shifted quickly to one of accusation, her eyes darting toward me as if to punctuate her claim with visual evidence, pointing directly at the house I had grown up in. The home I had invested my sweat and money into, the walls that had absorbed the laughter, the arguments, the late-night whispers of hope and worry, her finger trembling with excitement as she announced, "This person, they're breaking in." And in that moment, I froze, my mind racing faster than my pulse, imagining all the absurd scenarios that could explain her behavior, none of them rational, none of them fair, all of them tinged with the kind of malice or delusion that leaves you questioning whether you are still in the same world you had left in the morning, because she was pointing at my house, my keys, my life, as if ownership could be so casually dismissed, and the sheer audacity of it stole my breath, left me rooted in place, staring at her. Then at the officer, then back at her again, each glance a jolt, a mixture of anger, disbelief, and the creeping fear that somehow this situation could spiral beyond control. Officer Daniels looked from Karen to me, hesitation written across his face, a subtle furrow between his brows, as if he was weighing his options, trying to determine which version of reality he should believe, and I could see it in his eyes, that moment of human doubt, because the scene before him was absurd, almost theatrical. Yet Karen was pushing it with a relentless confidence that made his duty as a law enforcement officer difficult, complicated by the boldness of her accusation. A claim so baseless yet delivered with such certainty that it almost seemed plausible to a less discerning observer, and my hands itched to reach for my keys, to step out of the car and assert ownership, to prove the reality that had been so casually ignored. But Officer Daniels raised a hand gently, signaling me to pause, and I understood immediately that protocol, the need for caution, was slowing down the action my mind was already racing to take, and that pause stretched unbearably. Seconds thick with tension, as Karen continued her performance, pointing, waving, pleading with the officer, her voice high and insistent. He, or she, they're inside. I saw them go in, call it in, as though the truth could be shaped simply by the force of repetition, and I could feel a mix of emotions rising: anger at her audacity, fear at the implications, disbelief at how much she could manipulate perception with nothing but theatrics and baseless claims, frustration at the helplessness of standing there, limited by the law, while my own home was at the center of a false narrative, my sanctuary threatened by someone who had no regard for truth. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely only a few breaths, Officer Daniels spoke again, his voice firmer, tinged with cautious authority. "Sir, ma'am, can we clarify the situation? Are you the homeowner here?" And in that moment, it was as if time slowed, the tension suspended in the air between the three of us, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lawn, glinting off the windows of my house, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, the quiet hum of my car engine suddenly deafening in its contrast to the chaos unfolding, and I realized that words alone were necessary now. A simple declaration to cut through the fog of accusation, to assert reality over her delusion. And I opened my mouth to speak, voice steady despite the adrenaline. "Yes, I live here. This is my house." "You're mistaken." And as I said it, I could see the faintest flicker of doubt cross Corinne's face, a momentary crack in her confident facade, though she quickly masked it with indignation, ready to fight, ready to twist perception further. But Officer Daniels, now aware of the real dynamics, straightened slightly, the professional clarity returning, and I stepped out of my car, keys in hand, moving slowly toward the front door, aware of every step, the way the pavement felt beneath my shoes. The air thick with tension, each movement deliberate, a silent message that I was reclaiming what was mine, my presence a physical assertion of reality over false accusation. And as I unlocked the door, the familiar click and slide of the lock sounded like a small victory, a subtle but powerful affirmation of ownership, and I entered my home, briefly glancing back at Corinne, who now stood fuming, her minivan doors closed but her energy still radiating confrontation. And I realized with a mix of relief and lingering apprehension that this was only the beginning of what might be a long, exhausting ordeal with someone who seemed determined to make my life unnecessarily complicated. But for now, my house, my keys, my life, my sanctuary, though momentarily challenged, remained firmly under my control, and I could finally breathe again, though cautiously, knowing that the calm of the early return had been irrevocably altered by the audacity of one determined neighbor. Corinne's words cut through the air like a knife, sharp, rehearsed, dripping with a malice that seemed carefully cultivated over years of petty neighborhood squabbles. And though I could feel the heat rising to my face, my blood boiling with a mixture of anger and disbelief, I forced myself to remain calm, to breathe steadily, to keep the veneer of civility intact, because losing my temper in front of a police officer would only play into her hands, her every dramatic gesture designed to provoke, to unsettle, to make the absurd seem plausible. And I knew that despite the intensity of her performance, I had to ground myself in facts, in reality, in the simple truth that I owned this house, that my keys were real, my name was on the deed, and that no amount of theatrics could change that, even if she tried her hardest to convince someone otherwise. And so I held up my keys, the familiar weight in my hand grounding me, a tangible symbol of ownership, of right, and with deliberate clarity I said, "Officer, I live here. You can check the address," letting the words hang in the air, each syllable precise, each pause intentional, a calm island amid the storm of accusation she was unleashing. And I could see, almost imperceptibly at first, the tiniest crack in her facade, her eyes narrowing, her lips pressed together in a momentary flash of irritation before she quickly masked it with that practiced sneer, a mixture of disbelief and malice that she seemed to wear as armor, a costume perfected through years of petty conflicts, HOA disputes, and imagined grievances. And yet, in her intensity, there was something almost theatrical, as though she believed that sheer confidence could bend reality, that her conviction could rewrite the simple fact that this was my home, my life, my sanctuary. Officer Daniels hesitated for a fraction of a second, his expression a careful mix of professionalism and caution, as though he had been trained to avoid being manipulated by overzealous complainants, but was also human enough to recognize that the scene before him was unusual, almost surreal. And after that pause, he nodded, acknowledging the validity of my statement without directly confronting Karen, and with a polite, controlled tone he said, "All right, sir. I just need to verify a few things. Please step aside while I check the property." And I complied, moving slowly to the side, every step measured, aware that this was a performance in more ways than one, a careful dance between authority, perception, and truth. Because even as I stood there, my heart still hammering, I understood that appearances mattered as much as facts in moments like this, and that my composure could either reinforce my credibility or invite further doubt. And so I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs, and reminded myself that the house behind me, the keys in my hand, and the deed in my file cabinet were my silent allies, invisible yet undeniable, steadfast witnesses to reality in the face of her audacity. I could see Karen now, her phone pressed tightly against her ear, her lips moving rapidly in furious whispers, her eyes darting back and forth between me and the officer, likely reporting, scheming, calling for backup, or spreading yet another rumor to anyone who would listen, as though the mere act of accusation could generate support, regardless of truth. And her energy was relentless, aggressive, almost infectious in its intensity, radiating a sense of urgency and confrontation that made the afternoon feel charged with electricity, every nerve ending alert, every instinct screaming that this was no ordinary neighborly disagreement, but a calculated attempt to manipulate, intimidate, and disrupt. And I could feel the tension in the air thickening, pressing down like a physical weight, as Officer Daniels began to walk around the perimeter of the property, his boots crunching softly on the gravel, his eyes scanning the lawn, the walkway, the driveway, taking note of details, checking for signs of forced entry, any evidence that might lend credence to her claims. And with each step he took, my anticipation grew, a quiet, taut tension coiling in my chest like a spring ready to release, because I knew that once he confirmed the obvious, the absurdity of her accusations would be laid bare. Yet there remained a precarious moment, a delicate balance where perception and reality could collide dangerously. As I watched from the side, I noticed small details I had never paid much attention to before, the subtle rustling of leaves in the wind, the way shadows stretched across the front porch, the glint of sunlight off the windows, all framed against the figure of Karen, packing slightly, phone clutched tightly, her expression a mixture of desperation and triumph, each gesture exaggerated, each whisper a calculated act meant to assert urgency, and I could feel my own pulse steadying, my anger giving way to a sharp, alert focus, because in situations like this, patience and observation mattered more than immediate reaction, and I reminded myself repeatedly that facts would prevail, that the officer's eyes, trained to notice irregularities and patterns, would see the truth even if she tried to weave a narrative to obscure it, and that my calm, deliberate presence would contrast sharply against her frantic energy, strengthening my credibility simply through consistency and restraint. I could hear snippets of her muttered words over the faint static of her phone, words like trespasser, illegal, you need to come now, a frantic litany meant to amplify tension, meant to convince unseen allies that some great injustice was unfolding. And yet in those moments I also felt a strange clarity, a sharp awareness of the absurdity of it all, the theatrical extremes of human behavior when obsession, pride, and paranoia converge. And it struck me that this was not just about property or HOA rules, but about control, ego, and the need to dominate perception even in the absence of truth, a lesson that was unfolding before me in real time, a high-stakes drama played out in my own driveway, with my home as the unwilling stage. Officer Daniels circled the house, checking doors, windows, and locks, his face showing the careful consideration of someone weighing evidence impartially, and I could see the gradual shift in his posture, the subtle relaxation in his shoulders, the quiet acknowledgement that everything aligned with reality, that nothing out of the ordinary was occurring, no signs of forced entry, no evidence of trespassing, only a homeowner standing on his own property. And as he reached the back of the house and returned toward the front, I could feel the tide beginning to turn, a sense of vindication building silently, a reassurance that reason would triumph over her theatrics. And yet Karen, sensing the change, raised her voice, attempting to inject doubt, trying to reassert control, but her words now seemed slightly hollow, less certain, because the officer's careful, methodical actions were slowly dismantling her narrative, revealing the emptiness of her claims, the fragility of her conviction, and I could see it, subtle but undeniable, in the way her shoulders tensed, the way her eyes flicked repeatedly between the officer and me, searching for some sign of compliance that would never come. Finally, Officer Daniels returned, his expression composed but firm, a blend of professional authority and human understanding, and he addressed Karen directly, his voice calm yet unmistakably resolute. "Ma'am, I don't see any evidence of trespassing. Everything appears to be in order. The homeowner is here, and there's no sign of forced entry." And in that instant, the tension that had gripped the air seemed to crack, a small fracture appearing in the drama she had so meticulously staged, her lips parting slightly, a brief flicker of disbelief crossing her face, though she quickly masked it with irritation and disdain, and I could feel the weight lifting from my chest, the adrenaline ebbing, replaced by a mixture of relief, lingering anger and quiet satisfaction, because the truth, finally, had spoken louder than her lies. Yet even as Officer Daniels wrapped up his check, I sensed that this was far from over, that Karen's obsession with control and drama would not simply vanish with the dismissal of her claim, and that this encounter, while victorious, was merely a prelude to future conflicts, minor battles in what promised to be a prolonged and exhausting war over territory, perception, and power. But for now, as I held my keys, stood firm, and watched the officer prepare to leave, I allowed myself a small, private moment of triumph, knowing that my home, my property, and my truth remained intact, and that reason, patience, and persistence had prevailed over theatrics, malice, and unfounded accusation, a lesson I would carry forward in the tense days to come. 10 minutes later, Officer Daniels returned, his expression a confusing blend of frustration, disbelief, and barely contained irritation, his uniform slightly disheveled from packing around the property, the sunlight glinting off his badge and casting fleeting shadows across the lawn. And as he stopped in front of Karen, his voice low but sharp, he began carefully, almost cautiously, "Ma'am, or should I say Karen?" His words dragged in the air, measured, each one loaded with incredulity, as though he were trying to prepare her for the reality he was about to deliver. And she froze, her phone slipping slightly from her hand, her face draining of color as she registered the shift in tone, a dawning awareness creeping across her features that the game she had been playing might finally be unraveling, her eyes darting nervously from him to me, seeking some form of backup, some reassurance that she could rely on the narrative she had spun over the past 3 weeks, and failing to find any, the tension in the air thickened, pressing down on all of us like a tangible, suffocating weight, each second stretching as the enormity of what was unfolding slowly sank in. The officer's next words hit like a thunderclap, slow, deliberate, and undeniably real. "You're living here." The pause, the way he emphasized each syllable, was deliberate, forcing a reckoning with the truth, and I could see the almost imperceptible twitch in her lips, the micro-expressions of panic that contradicted the confident, overbearing persona she had cultivated so carefully, her usual bravado faltering for the first time in my presence, a stark and undeniable crack in the armor of control she had relied upon for so long, and as the words settled, my mind raced, trying to process the layers of audacity and absurdity that her actions represented, the reality of it almost too surreal to comprehend, that she had managed to occupy my own home for weeks, moving through my spaces as if they were hers, organizing, inspecting, and maneuvering with a confidence that bordered on delusion, a trespass so brazen and so prolonged that it defied basic logic. Yet there she stood, frozen, caught in a moment of undeniable guilt. Her past 3 weeks of scheming and intrusive behavior condensed into a single, inescapable confrontation. It took me a moment to find words, to translate the shock and disbelief into coherent thought, to confront not only the audacity, but also the implications of what had occurred, the sheer magnitude of violation that extended beyond physical trespassing into psychological manipulation, an invasion that had subtly crept into my life while I had been elsewhere, the sense of safety and control I had taken for granted utterly compromised by the person standing before me. The person I had known as a neighbor, a representative of the HOA, and now, in the starkest terms, an intruder exploiting loopholes and privileges she had no right to claim. And the more I looked at her, the more I recognized the meticulous strategy behind her audacity, the careful cultivation of complaints, the strategic timing of calls, the effort to appear righteous while encroaching on my life. And I realized that this was not just recklessness or ignorance. It was deliberate, methodical, and calculated, a level of premeditation that made the situation almost cinematic in its absurdity, yet horrifying in its real-world consequences. Officer Daniels shook his head slightly, the muscle in his jaw tightening as he took in the scene, and his voice, though still calm, carried a weight of authority now tinged with disbelief and rising frustration. "I don't understand how this happened. The HOA can't legally authorize someone to occupy your home. This is highly irregular and frankly illegal." His eyes met mine briefly, silently communicating both an apology for the surreal situation and reassurance that he would take steps to rectify it. And I nodded, absorbing the gravity of his words, trying to reconcile the initial outrage with the necessity for measured action, for documentation, for proof, for justice. Because even in the face of absurdity, the law was a tool, a weapon, and a shield, and it had to be wielded carefully in situations like this, where human ego and manipulation collided with legal reality in ways that were almost impossible to believe. Karen, still frozen, finally found a whisper of protest, her voice shaky, betraying the panic she was trying desperately to mask. I was just inspecting. It's an HOA thing." I thought. Her explanation trailed off, collapsing under the weight of evidence, the authority of the officer, and the undeniable fact that I had returned, that I held the keys, and that my home was unequivocally mine. And I could see the frustration mounting as she realized that the rules she had invented in her mind held no power here, that her carefully constructed narrative, the 3 weeks of manipulations, calls, and petty complaints, was suddenly meaningless in the face of reality. And yet, even as the situation seemed resolved, the audacity lingered, the cognitive dissonance of someone thinking they could live in your home, unchecked for weeks without consequence, was almost too much to process, leaving a residue of disbelief that made the next steps feel both urgent and surreal. As Officer Daniels began taking notes, documenting the trespass, I watched him move with a practiced efficiency, recording statements, confirming the facts, making the necessary calls to ensure that Karen's occupation of the property would not go unaddressed, and I realized in that moment how surreal the entire ordeal had become. The juxtaposition of normal suburban life with the grotesque absurdity of an overzealous neighbor exploiting imaginary loopholes, occupying my private spaces, filing complaints, and calling the authorities against the rightful owner, all while believing she was acting within her rights. And I felt a mixture of vindication, disbelief, and residual anger, a cocktail of emotions that refused to settle easily, leaving me simultaneously exhilarated at the exposure of her audacity and deeply unsettled by the invasion of my home. Karen's attempts to justify herself grew more frantic as the minutes passed, her explanations splintering into fragments. It's temporary. I was making sure everything was fine. I didn't know you'd be back. I'm protecting the HOA." But each phrase sounded hollow, rehearsed, desperate, a thin veneer over the brazen reality of her actions, and Officer Daniels listened patiently, his expression a careful balance of professional courtesy and rising incredulity, gently steering the conversation toward facts and documentation, cutting through the chaotic narrative she was weaving. And as he did, the truth became irrefutably clear. She had no legal right, no moral justification, and no credible explanation for living in my home, and the full scope of the audacity hit me all at once. The 3 weeks of unseen invasion, the petty HOA complaints, the calls to authorities, all converging into a moment of shocking clarity that left me momentarily speechless. Finally, as Officer Daniels prepared to take formal action, giving Karen explicit instructions to vacate immediately and warning her of legal consequences for her prolonged trespass, I could feel a wave of relief mixed with lingering anger washing over me, my pulse beginning to normalize, my mind racing through the details of the next steps: the insurance, the HOA reporting, the documentation of damage or interference. Yet beneath it all, there was a strange sense of vindication. The satisfaction that the truth had finally emerged, that the audacity of a neighbor so bold, so reckless, so manipulative, had been fully exposed in the presence of authority, and that my home, my keys, and my life had been defended not just by law but by simple, undeniable reality. And as I watched Corinne collect her things, her expression a mixture of embarrassment, frustration, and defeat, escorted by Officer Daniels toward the driveway, I realized that this confrontation would be a story I would recount over and over, a tale of surreal audacity, boundary violations, and the eventual triumph of truth over brazen deception. A reminder that even in the quiet suburban rhythms of life, chaos could erupt in the most astonishing, unbelievable ways, and that vigilance, composure, and adherence to facts were the only reliable shields against it. The air was thick with tension as Officer Daniels shifted his weight slightly, hands resting casually yet authoritatively on his utility belt, eyes narrowing just enough to convey the seriousness of the situation, and he directed a measured but unmistakably firm gaze toward Corinne, the kind of look that communicates the limits of patience and the boundaries of law. And then, with deliberate clarity, he stated, "You cannot live here. This is trespassing," the words slicing through the charged atmosphere, a legal and moral assertion that left no room for ambiguity. And in that instant, the full weight of reality seemed to hit her, a sudden, almost physical impact, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling under the authority of an officer whose patience had limits, whose judgment was grounded in law rather than rumor or ego, and I could see her body stiffen, her fingers tightening around her phone, the slight tremor betraying the panic that had begun to seep into her composure, her face flushing with a mix of embarrassment, fury, and disbelief, as though the very idea that she could be held accountable for living in someone else's home was beyond her capacity to process, a concept that reality had cruelly imposed upon her without warning, shattering the illusion of control she had so meticulously cultivated over weeks of petty complaints, subtle intrusions, and imagined authority. Corinne's voice came out in stammering bursts, a desperate attempt to justify herself, the words spilling out like water from a cracked dam. I was just checking the property." Her tone oscillated between pleading and defensive, a bizarre mixture of entitlement and panic, as if stating her intentions aloud could somehow retroactively legitimize 3 weeks of brazen, rent-free occupation, and the absurdity of the claim hung in the air, almost comical if it weren't so infuriating. The image of her unpacking clothes, using the bathroom, rearranging items in someone else's home, while calling it an inspection, illustrating the sheer audacity. The cognitive dissonance that allowed her to reconcile her actions with an imagined authority, and I could see the disbelief mirrored in Officer Daniels' eyes, a subtle tightening of his jaw, the faint clench of his fist at his side, a physical manifestation of frustration tempered by the need for professional decorum, and his response, dry, precise, and cutting without unnecessary emotion, punctuated the absurdity perfectly. "I don't think that's called checking when you're unpacking clothes and using the bathroom." The statement landing like a scalpel, stripping away the flimsy pretense of justification she had been clinging to, leaving only raw, undeniable truth in its wake, a truth that could not be argued away or softened by rhetoric, a reality that demanded immediate compliance. I stood there quietly, watching her reaction unfold, my body tense but my mind alert, absorbing every nuance of expression, every twitch of muscle, every faltering word. Because in moments like these, silence can speak louder than any argument, and my quiet presence became a mirror reflecting the consequences of her actions, the stark reality that obsession with control, when untempered by reason or respect for others, has a way of isolating those who wield it, leaving them exposed and vulnerable, and I could see the realization beginning to dawn in her eyes, slow, reluctant, and unwilling at first, that she had overstepped every conceivable boundary, not just legally but morally, socially, and psychologically, that her attempts to dominate, manipulate, and assert authority over my life and property had finally crossed a line that could not be ignored, and that the repercussions of this breach were now unavoidable, unfolding in real time before her very eyes. Officer Daniel stepped closer, a subtle but deliberate move, reducing her space, emphasizing authority, and reinforcing the seriousness of the situation without raising his voice. His presence alone a commanding force, a tangible reminder that the law does not negotiate with delusion or ego, and he continued, now more firmly, outlining the immediate consequences, the illegality of her actions, the need to vacate the premises, and the potential penalties for failing to comply. Each statement carefully calibrated to remove ambiguity and leave her with no option but recognition and retreat, while I felt a complex mix of emotions swelling inside me. Relief that the law and authority were finally aligned with reality, anger at the audacity and disrespect she had shown over weeks, and a cautious sense of vindication that the truth was finally undeniable in the presence of someone trained to enforce it. Karen's body language shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, a slight slump of the shoulders, a lowering of her gaze, the tension in her hands easing minutely, but her pride still flared in sporadic gestures, the sharp movements of her head, the nervous packing, the defensive folding of arms, a mixture of defiance and reluctant acknowledgement, and I realized that this confrontation was not just about reclaiming my home physically, but also asserting boundaries psychologically, socially, and morally. A necessary act to restore the equilibrium she had so recklessly disrupted, because her obsession with control, her belief that she could manipulate perception and authority simultaneously, had created a chaos that required more than words. It demanded the undeniable presence of law, reason, and unflinching assertion of reality. I watched as Officer Daniels finally made it explicit. She needed to remove herself immediately. She could not remain in the house, and any further attempts to claim ownership, inspection rights, or any HOA loophole would be met with legal action, documentation, and likely prosecution. And I could see the shift in Karen, the hesitation as she realized compliance was unavoidable, the slow, begrudging acknowledgement that she had lost the battle not just physically, but in perception, her aura of control dissolving in the presence of authority and truth. And yet there remained a trace of her old arrogance, a last flicker of ego and entitlement that made her posture rigid, her words clipped, as though she might yet argue, resist, or manipulate, but it was faint, a ghost of defiance overshadowed by the certainty of exposure and the imminence of consequences. I stood quietly, letting her shame settle, not needing to speak, not needing to assert anything further, because the combination of authority, evidence, and undeniable facts was sufficient. And in that quiet observation, I recognized a crucial truth about human nature, about the perils of obsession and entitlement, about the way some people believe that rules and boundaries are negotiable if only they persist long enough or push hard enough, and I felt a mixture of satisfaction and caution. Knowing that while this immediate confrontation had been successful, the psychological aftershocks of her obsession might linger, influencing future interactions. But for this moment, justice, reality, and personal sovereignty had prevailed, And as Karen finally began to gather herself, muttering excuses under her breath, packing her things with a mixture of resentment and resignation, escorted by Officer Daniels to the driveway, I realized that this was a decisive turning point. A moment where obsession collided with law, theatrics met reality, and the consequences of overstepping boundaries were made perfectly clear, leaving her exposed, shamed, and utterly powerless in the face of undeniable truth. And I stood there silently, feeling a quiet, resolute satisfaction, the knowledge that my home, my life, and my control had been defended without unnecessary confrontation, relying instead on calm, measured assertion, law, and the unshakable weight of reality against her delusion. Karen was escorted out immediately, her face flushed bright red, a mix of humiliation, anger, and disbelief painting every feature as Officer Daniels guided her to her minivan, the tires crunching against the gravel driveway, a stark auditory punctuation to the end of her audacious 3-week trespass, and I could feel the residual tension lingering in the air long after the door closed behind her, a palpable sense of release mixed with lingering vigilance. The kind of alertness that comes when you realize just how fragile personal boundaries can be when someone with delusions of entitlement decides to exploit them. And the very next day, I moved quickly to reclaim the sense of security that had been so brazenly violated, changing all the locks with deliberate care, the click of each bolt a reassuring affirmation that my home was now physically fortified against intrusion, while the installation of a new security system, sensors, cameras, and alerts served not only as a practical measure, but also as a psychological shield, a constant reminder that the audacity of one overzealous neighbor would no longer dictate the rhythm of my life or the safety of my sanctuary. And as I moved through the house, checking each lock, ensuring that windows were secure, and calibrating the alarm, I felt a mixture of relief, satisfaction, and lingering disbelief. The surreal nature of the previous weeks slowly settling into a narrative that was almost absurd in its audacity, but undeniably real in its consequences. A cautionary tale of ego, obsession, and boundary violations that had played out within the walls of my own home. The news of Karen's exposure and her subsequent humiliation spread through the neighborhood with astonishing speed, carried on whispered conversations, subtle glances, and pointed references at social gatherings, the kind of informal but potent social currency that can alter reputations almost instantly. And I observed, with a mixture of curiosity and quiet vindication, as her once dominant presence in HOA circles began to diminish, her authority and influence fading as neighbors recalibrated their perception of her, realizing that the woman who had so aggressively wielded power, threatened fines, and called law enforcement over trivial matters was, in fact, capable of the most absurd and self-serving behavior imaginable, exploiting legal loopholes in her mind to justify living rent-free in someone else's home, a revelation that left her credibility in tatters and her social capital evaporating almost overnight. The whispers of inspection, now tinged with ridicule and incredulity, reframing her image from that of an enforcer or moral guardian to a figure of embarrassment, audacity, and outright freeloading, a transformation that subtly but irrevocably shifted the dynamics of neighborhood interactions, alliances, and influence. HOA meetings, which had once been arenas where Karen exerted influence through intimidation, petty fines, and relentless complaints, now carried a different energy, a cautious, measured tone replacing the previously tense and fearful atmosphere, and I could see the subtle but unmistakable change in posture and behavior among attendees, the way longtime members who had once nodded along or deferred to her now questioned her authority, raised clarifying points, and hesitated to allow her opinions to dominate discussions, the ripple effect of her trespass and subsequent exposure altering the internal politics of the neighborhood, creating space for more balanced dialogue, genuine oversight, and a collective recalibration of what constituted acceptable conduct, boundaries, and respect for personal property. as if the very act of living rent-free in someone else's home had served as a brutal but effective lesson in accountability, transparency, and the limits of ego-driven behavior. Even casual encounters on the street carried subtle changes. The way neighbors looked at her with thinly veiled incredulity, whispered behind partially closed doors, or exchanged glances of quiet amusement and incredulity, as though collectively acknowledging the audacity of her actions, while silently agreeing that such behavior could no longer be tolerated. And I could feel a sense of vindication in observing these reactions, knowing that the truth had prevailed, that her reputation had been recalibrated, and that my own efforts to maintain calm, assert authority, and rely on law and procedure had not only protected my property, but also subtly reshaped the social ecosystem in which she had operated, exposing the fragility of influence built on fear, intimidation, and self-serving interpretations of authority, and demonstrating that actions, no matter how meticulously staged, carry consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. I also noticed the psychological impact on Corinne herself. Her usual confidence noticeably diminished, the energy she had previously wielded like a weapon now replaced by careful, constrained movements, an awareness that every word, every glance, and every interaction was being scrutinized in light of her recent trespass. And I could see the subtle signs of anxiety, hesitation, and resentment in her behavior, the constant recalibration as she navigated the changed perception of her neighbors. A once dominant figure now forced into a defensive stance, weighing every action against the memory of exposure, the knowledge that her actions had been witnessed, documented, and judged both legally and socially, and the realization that influence built on manipulation could be so easily undermined when reality, authority, and personal vigilance aligned. In the following weeks, life slowly returned to normal, though with a heightened awareness, a subtle vigilance that I carried forward as a protective instinct, a reminder that boundaries, while invisible, are only effective when actively defended, and that audacity without accountability is often fleeting, a lesson embodied in Corinne's diminished presence and the quiet satisfaction of neighbors who, through observation, now understood that the woman who once ruled the HOA through fear and manipulation had been decisively checked, her authority curtailed, and her narrative reframed as one of audacity, absurdity, and social overreach. A cautionary tale whispered with a mixture of amusement, disbelief, and moral acknowledgement. And as I walked through my newly secured home, testing locks, monitoring cameras, and enjoying the restored sense of safety, I felt a profound mixture of relief, vindication, and cautious optimism. Knowing that while vigilance would always be necessary, the immediate threat had been neutralized, the balance restored, and my sanctuary reclaimed, leaving behind the echoes of absurdity, the whispers of the neighborhood, and the comforting knowledge that audacity without boundaries eventually meets the unyielding weight of reality. A week later, the world outside my front door felt almost surreal in its calm, a stark contrast to the chaos and absurdity that had dominated the previous weeks. And as I stepped onto my porch with a cup of coffee, the sunlight spilling gently across the freshly secured locks and the neatly maintained lawn, I could finally exhale, letting the tension that had coiled in my shoulders and chest for days, maybe even weeks, slowly unwind, a release so profound that it almost felt unfamiliar. The quiet hum of suburban life, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the gentle breeze, distant children playing, the occasional hum of a passing car, all of it underscoring a sense of restored normalcy that I had longed for more than I had realized, the kind of peace that comes not just from the absence of conflict, but from the certainty that one's personal boundaries are respected, that one's home, the very foundation of comfort and stability, is once again secure, and that the absurdity, audacity, an invasive obsession of one overzealous neighbor has been decisively curtailed, leaving space for genuine calm, reflection, and reprieve. As if to reinforce that sense of restored order, Officer Daniels dropped by, his presence a reminder of both authority and the human side of law enforcement, a friendly face in what had been a surreal ordeal, and his easy smile, relaxed posture, and casual tone conveyed reassurance and camaraderie, the kind that subtly reassures you that the chaos has not left any permanent scars on either the legal or social fabric of your life. And as he leaned casually against the edge of my porch, his hands tucked into the pockets of his uniform pants, he said, almost conversationally, "I've seen some HOA craziness in my career," a statement that could have been dry or clinical in less skilled hands, but which in his voice carried the weight of experience and subtle amusement. But this might be a first, and I could see the hint of disbelief still lingering behind his professional demeanor, a quiet acknowledgement of just how surreal Karen's trespass had been, a combination of audacity, delusion, and manipulation that had somehow manifested in my own home, and the irony of it, the sheer absurdity, was not lost on either of us, eliciting a small laugh, a brief but meaningful connection over shared understanding of just how extraordinary the situation had been. I laughed in return, the sound more natural than I had realized it could be, light and unburdened, a small celebration of normalcy, of victory, and of sanity restored, replying, "Let's hope it's the last," a statement that was part humor, part wishful thinking, and entirely sincere in its underlying sentiment, because the weeks of absurd confrontation, intrusive complaints, and surreal trespass had left their mark, not physically, but in the form of a lingering hyper-awareness, a subtle anxiety that I now consciously allowed myself to release, letting the boundaries of my home, my sanctuary, and my mental peace settle firmly back into their rightful places, and I could feel a tangible lightness in my chest as the tension ebbed, replaced by a warm, quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes not just from conflict resolved, but from the understanding that one has navigated chaos with calm, patience, and an unwavering adherence to truth, law, and personal integrity, and that the audacity of others, no matter how extreme, ultimately meets its limits when confronted with reality. I walked slowly around the house, inspecting the locks I had changed, double-checking the sensors I had installed, monitoring the perimeter cameras that now blinked softly with reassuring lights. And as I moved, I realized the depth of relief that came not only from practical measures of security, but from the restoration of control over my own space, a reclamation of authority, safety, and dignity, and every detail, from the faint click of a properly secured door to the soft whir of a security camera adjusting its angle, reinforced the sense that my home was once again mine, undisturbed, a sanctuary untainted by intrusion or obsessive meddling, and that the lessons learned, the vigilance exercised, and the calm yet decisive action taken had preserved not just my physical environment but my mental well-being, my ability to enjoy simple pleasures without fear, and the fundamental trust in the stability of one's own life. Even the neighborhood seemed to breathe with me, a subtle change in energy, a quiet acknowledgement of the restored equilibrium, the way neighbors' conversations resumed their ordinary rhythm, how the gossip that had swirled around Karen's antics now carried a mixture of amusement, disbelief, and quiet moral vindication, and I felt a satisfaction in knowing that her influence had waned, her audacity exposed, and her manipulations rendered ineffective. A social and practical recalibration that reinforced the idea that overreach, obsession, and trespass carry consequences both legal and social, and that truth, patience, and calm assertion of boundaries remain powerful tools in navigating the complexities of human behavior. As Officer Daniels prepared to leave, giving a final nod, a friendly pat on the shoulder, and a few words of casual advice on maintaining security and peace of mind, I watched him go with a feeling of genuine gratitude. The knowledge that his presence, both during the crisis and in its aftermath, had reinforced the boundaries of law, reason, and protection in ways that words alone could never fully achieve, and I turned back toward my home, sipping the cooling coffee in my hand, the warmth seeping into my fingers, and for the first time in weeks I allowed myself to fully relax, to enjoy the ordinary sounds of life unmolested by audacity, the quiet humming of appliances, the soft rustle of curtains in the breeze, the comforting creak of familiar floorboards, each sound a subtle affirmation that my home was safe, my sanctuary restored, and my sanity intact. And as I glanced out the window toward the driveway, imagining Karen somewhere beyond my property, the lesson of boundaries, consequence, and audacity lingering in the air, I felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet triumph, and a renewed appreciation for the ordinary, uninterrupted rhythm of life, knowing that while vigilance would always remain a prudent measure, for now the chaos had passed, the home was secure, and my life once again flowed in calm, steady, and reassuring harmony.